Oh, good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to another of our Webinar Wednesdays. This is Kelly Bearden, the director of the CSU Bakersfield SBDC, and we're back for our Managing Your Small Business Beyond the Pandemic series. And this is the one each month where we try to catch up and try to fill in the blanks of kind of hustling through a lot of webinars on previous Wednesdays. So this week, we're going to cover a lot of the items in depth and look at some other issues and other things going on. Now, my screen is intentionally blank. I trust you that I am live, but we are experiencing a little bit of the internet's in and outs today. So it's best maybe to go with the video off, preserve the bandwidth, and roll on down the road. That's what we're going to do. So I'm here, you just can't see me. Maybe that's a better thing. What's up today? Today, November the 3rd. Well, it's our 1 week where we do a deeper dive on things, but we also want to look at things such as recovering businesses, trends, and issues. We've had a lot of going on since we've reopened our businesses. And a lot of these have been good and some of them not so good. A lot of the trends and issues that are affecting small businesses as they rebound from the COVID-19 crisis. We'll look at take our bigger looks. So we've been looking a lot at EIDL, but we'll also look at maybe a PPP appeals process. We'll look at the PPP forgiveness that we really haven't talked much about in quite a while. We'll touch briefly on a couple of the other programs, such as the California Venues program. We'll touch a little bit on last week's topic, the employee retention credits that are available, and really send you back that direction to last week if you really want to know more on that, because it's great advice last week. But the California Venues program is open, and also where to go to for details of these. This is our one chance each month to get into a little bit more details without a guest speaker. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue to kind of look at that, but where to go for details. And for details, I'm going to be referring you back to some previous webinars that we've done on specific topics that have been really topical for some of these issues that you might have. And that very own resource might be right there at that particular place and point in time. We will also take your questions, and we're going to forgo the poll. We're going to save the poll for next week when it's a little bit better. So for those of you just joining us, I am here today and I am live. You will not see me as we are trying to conserve a little bit of bandwidth in the building. So, okay, so that's what's up for today, November 3rd. Let's get rolling. I did mention some resources that we have on particular topics, and these are our CSU SBDC webinars that are available on demand on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which is CSU SBDC. So here are some of the more frequent ones that tend to be a little bit more popular. They're more topical driven. Number 80, we're back on September 22nd on EIDL with Keith Bryce. I mentioned that a lot to people. Last week, we did have Michael Stevenson on the employee retention credit. So on 10/27, you can go back and find that particular topic and get a lot more detail than we're going to discuss even today. We had our human resource COVID expert on, and we talked about issues related to that back on, I call it number 77. So must have been about 9 weeks ago. Back on the 1st of September with our special guest, then John McFarland. Employees always seems to be a hot topic and continues to be so right now. So if you're looking for some of the things that we did on trying to locate employees during the pandemic and some of the incentive programs that you can take advantage of, we had our special guest, Teresa Hitchcock of America's Job Center, who was on with us. And that was back on June 16th, number 66. And also our last really deep foray into PPP forgiveness was a week earlier than that, back on June the 9th. And we talked a lot about the issues of forgiveness, the new forgiveness portal that is open. Again, your lender is going to be driving that if you haven't gone through that as well. And California venues, we're going to probably talk a little bit more on that today than we have, since that program is open. Talk a little bit about more on that, but that will be in the archives at the conclusion of today's webinar. So on to our status and action of key stimulus programs. Please remember, EIDL is open. You can apply for an EIDL. If you have not previously applied, you can apply for reconsideration if it has been declined within the last 6 months, or you can apply for an increase. And we'll go over the reasons briefly on why you might want to do any of those 3 items. The employee retention credit, it remains open through the end of the year. As mentioned last week, it could get truncated down to September 30th, depending on other legislation that we've talked about in previous weeks. But right now it is open until the end of this year. Our California Venues Grant Program, grant program up to $250,000 is currently open. It opened last week and remains open until November 19th, getting some really interesting discussions and interesting calls with individuals on some of the things that are happening along California venues. And really one of them I'll share now just so I don't forget later on. But one of the interesting things that is happening is that generally your NACE code, basically your industry category code, which is that 6-digit number that identifies what type of business you are. And it gets very specific, going out 6 digits. So your NACE is replaced, of course, some of the older codes that we used. But oftentimes what happens is business owners really don't get involved in that process. And we found a couple of instances where your accountant will go in and will assign you a NACE. And that's usually all fine and dandy, but we're running into situations where there's specifics to the California Venues Grant Program, where you need to be in one particular NACE code or another in order to be able to qualify for that program. So even getting back into the process of trying to figure out then what is the next step, if any, if your tax return has an improper NACE code or is one that is outside of what they consider funding in the California Venues Grants. And it looks like that process takes you back to the actual nonprofit organization that issues the code to try to get you reclassified. Now, the question is can that happen by November 19th? So stay tuned for that. But really something important that I think all small businesses should check out is that industry code, and to make sure that your industry code is correct on your tax return. So your EIDL targeted supplemental, your targeted and your supplemental advances are still open. The California Relief Grant Program has been closed. Every week I'm running into people that are part of, I guess, tens of thousands of people that for some reason didn't actually complete their application process after being notified from Lindustry.com that they were approved for a California relief grant in the amount of $5,000, $15,000, or $25,000. Now, one of the things that I probably would forget again, so I'll mention it now, is that one of the requirements that people get is that they have to produce a ID. They have to produce a state ID. It could be your driver's license. I think that's what most people use. But just the notion of having to do that is actually alarming individuals and alarming people that it could be spam, it could be fraud, it could be somebody phishing for their personal information. And I think a number of those that have not responded back to the California Relief Grant is for that one specific purpose. So, we'll see, but Lindustry is continuing to make it available to others that have been waitlisted. We've ran into people that have been waitlisted 6 times through the entire process from applying back in early January of this year that have now been funded for the California Relief Grant Program. So if you did apply and you did not get funded, check your emails, mention to other people also, ask them. You can be an ambassador, you could be the good steward and actually make sure that everybody's getting access to these programs. And lastly, our PPP forgiveness is open. Again, it's due 10 months from the end of your covered period. The covered period is something that you can elect, and so be it. Okay, let's talk about some of the trends, after the shutdown that we're starting to see and are starting to be observed. And so, many of our small businesses and some of the national reports on this particular topic has it, but customers are returning. They're returning. They're not returning as fast in some particular industries as others, but others, they are returning too fast. So what might be an industry where they're getting a little bit maybe ahead of the game? And let's go to the airline industry. Let's start there. So your airline industry has ran into some issues with a lot of canceled flights in the last couple of weeks. And so what is happening with these canceled flights? Part of it is weather. There's strong winds in Dallas and strong winds in California and some of the other things. But a lot of airlines, when they got into this crisis back in 2020, and let's face it, you talk about a business that you cannot mitigate very well, a pandemic, and that is an airline business. So airlines responded by, selling off some assets. They reduced their debt, they cut expenses, they offered early retirement for a number of their employees. And now they're having a hard time getting them back and getting back up to speed. So I think the lesson to be learned is that it isn't always easier after you have made significant cuts and you have reduced a lot of things to get that back going again. And that kind of ties in with number 2, with the supply chain as well, is trying to keep your supply chain going and doing a few things. But really the airline woes, 3 main airlines had really been canceling a lot of flights, and a lot of it is driven by they don't have employees. So you have American, who most recently had to cancel hundreds of flights. You had Southwest and Spirit Airlines canceling thousands of flights. And again, some of those were for weather, but a large part of their problem remains getting their employee and their workforce back. And that is an issue that everybody seems to be having. So supply chain, it continues to be a big issue, and a big issue with some of the people that we're talking about some of the issues that have been happening. So with supply chain, that problem continues. And really now, kind of a lot of businesses are coming out and saying, well, gee, we're having supply chain issues. Should we advertise? Should we still advertise? Now, I'm going to get to advertising in another of these bullets here. But really, it's kind of an interesting thing that a lot of people really wouldn't suspect, because you've had a supply chain crisis. Do you still want to drive customers to your particular product? And a lot of people are finding out with some of the firms like, say, Hershey's and some of the Procter & Gamble and some of the bigger companies, is that they are cutting back on some of their advertising, but they don't really want to lose the continuity of the long-term effect of advertising, but they want to minimize the problems that the supply chain is having. So supply chain kind of continues to be an issue that we're looking at. Still, this employees being slow to return, and there's a lot of reasons why employees aren't coming back. One of the more interesting ones I've read is that a lot of people that were near retirement age, maybe they accepted that early retirement from American Airlines or other ones. Or maybe what they decided to do was to just retire and throw it in early. And this is true with a lot of blue collar workers. So where you had a lot of baby boomers that were getting ready to leave, a lot of them left earlier than had anticipated. We're seeing a lot of other businesses that thought that their employees would return once the federal unemployment was discontinued and ceased, as it was in the first week of September. A lot of those numbers aren't coming back, and employees still are slow to return to work. And that is really affecting the ability of a lot of businesses and small businesses in particular to get back up to speed, to get back up to scale. So a lot of our issues that we have had issues with, supply chain, employees, continues to be a particular problem. So what are also a problem? With those two issues, it's kind of driving one other big factor, and that is prices increases. It's difficult when you're paying far more for some of your raw materials to keep your prices in line. We're starting to see inflation. We're going to have probably a good segment and good guest speakers come in and talk about the inflation and other of the general economic trends that are going on to try to keep this in front of our audience here. So inflation and prices remain really sensitive. So understanding that you got to pay more for your employees, you've got to pay more for the products and also the services that you're sourcing for your business, prices are going up. And that is affecting a lot of consumers' decisions and things like that. So a lot of companies are still out there betting that, that prices aren't going to really affect and that they will still keep coming back. We'd mentioned Procter & Gamble, who has a number of products such as your Gillette sensor razors and many other things, but they're starting to say that investments that they made in higher quality products will have customers continue to pay the high products. So maybe that they're looking at higher quality, more innovative, potentially better products will keep customers paying higher prices for their particular products. So along the same thing in inflation, as we're starting to see, one thing that's kind of unique is that wages are rising fast, and that is really contributing to that. And of course, the shortage is really testing the economy and has really kind of had customer prices rise at the fastest pace in 30 years last month. So while, employees were starting to see, boost as far as compensation goes and some of the other things, now it's starting to see that erode with higher customer prices. So yes, September 2021, the fastest pace for customer price increase in the last 30 years. And then one thing that's kind of interesting about this inflation angle is that some of the largest cities have some of the lowest US inflation rates in September. So you saw where cities such as New York, Chicago, and LA were below the national level, while rural areas grappled with, increases in a lot of different areas, including, of course, food and gasoline and cars and all kinds of fun stuff, used cars and trucks. So really, and it's really interesting where you see where LA comes in kind of at a low point, but then you look at some of the suburbs, and one of them is of LA, it's Riverside, and it's nearly 30% higher than the inflation change. So inflation in higher cities is actually being affected less than our rural communities and some of our other areas. I did find a place online where you can actually go to, and we'll include this in the handouts this week. We won't pull it out yet. But we found a place where you can have your own inflation rate calculator. You can customize your own consumer price index. So it basically is a calculator that uses basically what you're spending your budgeted money on each month and what you're seeing, and you can tell if it is different from the 4.9% from a year earlier. That is the adjusted CPI. So inflation, higher prices, that continues to be a particular issue. Now, oftentimes when we look at some industries, and we'll look at a few more in an upcoming slide, but I wanted to maybe jump ahead to a couple of chains, and they are in the food businesses. So just a couple of them that are doing well. And when I say food businesses, more or less along the lines of restaurants. The first one I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about is the Cheesecake Factory. And the Cheesecake Factory is a chain of a couple of hundred locations, 0 locations in Central California. So when I go through my Central California map and I talk about the Eastern Sierra in the western crest upward of the Sierra, the San Joaquin Valley, Central Coast, throw in the Mojave Desert. No locations of the Cheesecake Factory in any of those 13 counties. So Cheesecake Factories, though, are around in a lot of, large and pretty large cities, fairly large, I guess, just none in the San Joaquin Valley. So one thing that the Cheesecake Factory did and what they tried to do is, obviously, what they are is they're a restaurant that has an extensive menu. So they have a very broad menu that traditionally has a big sit down business. But when the pandemic started, they started to try to figure out how they could use the online model and also actually get more to-go sales. And the thing they found out by working with delivery services, people liked cheesecake at 10 o'clock at night. And they liked it delivered. They liked walking to their door and getting cheesecake at 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night or 8:30, whatever. But in the normal times, really kind of didn't happen that way. So, your Cheesecake Factories are about, 10,000 large locations, 10,000 square foot locations. But what they found was that after people started ordering cheesecake, that their average sales for to-go orders per location doubled. And it went from 1.5 million to 3 million. And typically a lot of that was for, maybe whole cheesecakes and things like that. But by doubling their post-pandemic orders to 3 million per location, they were able to actually potentially grow the business in what they think is going to be a sustainable business model. And one thing that they did was they, it's not unusual because to-go orders were up 45%. They didn't double, but they were up 45% at casual dining restaurants. But one thing really the Cheesecake Factory said that they did was they increased their marketing during the pandemic 60%. Now, I think a lot of people were kind of looking at this and saying, gee, this pandemic's on, where can I cut some expenses? Where can I cut some costs? And I think that marketing component of it was one of the things that were slashed. One of it was cut back. And so then, after that, I think that affected people to, pivot from a more traditional type of establishment like they were to more takeout delivery and other uses. So 16 million they spent, up 60% to reach customers who might order to go, who hadn't dined at their businesses before, and it worked. Some of the other kind of interesting notes and trends that they found out was that they did run into the same thing. They ran into a crisis as far as workers go. And as their model and as they continued to increase business, they ran into that same problem. Now, another business that really kind of turning into the chicken of In-N-Out burger is of course Chick-Fil-A. And Chick-fil-A in their standalone locations did extraordinarily well, probably aided by the drive-through in many of those locations, of course. But really, Chick-fil-A was another business that has tended to thrive through the pandemic. And it's really kind of been that particular model to really assist them get there as well. Some of the other things that are some of the other trends that we wanted to share with you and to go through. And this was according to Yelp. And we talked briefly about this in one of the webinars a few weeks ago. But Yelp is uniquely positioned because of so many businesses that use them. They're uniquely positioned to determine, that businesses close by the feedback they get from their subscribers. So the things that's interesting is the majority of businesses that temporarily closed in the beauty sector, for example, 90% of those have reopened. And also hotel and travel, 86%. And nightlife, your bars and lounges, etc., 83%. So it is interesting that they had, Yelp did report that I believe 85% of businesses that closed temporarily have reopened, which I think is really a testament to the fact of the pandemic relief programs that really assisted and really helped businesses keep going during this particular process. So that shouldn't be that huge of a surprise, but what is a surprise is the new business openings. And Yelp actually reported that in Q3 of 2021, you're seeing a lot more hotels and you're seeing a bigger increase in beauty, leisure, and hospitality than you did before. So back to the restaurants and food businesses, 83% that were temporarily closed have reopened as of September 30th. Also, look at the number of new restaurants and food businesses, which we see quite a few that have actually been opening. We thought we were going to see a lot more because we thought, some of the early numbers, we were looking at 30 to 40% of small businesses might be permanently closed. Whereas now that number is kind of hovering in the 15% range, according to this data from Yelp. So new restaurants and food businesses, as I think some locations did close, it did open up locations for new concepts, new projects, new ways of doing it. So we did particularly see that, but it was a 2% increase over the last year. And you're starting to see businesses that were really extraordinarily impacted, such as buffets and food courts and shopping malls and other large establishments that were really, really hammered because of really not really having an audience or having a ability to do takeout or delivery in a high volume fashion. Okay, so that's a little bit on trends and kind of a little bit where we are and what we see and what's been going on in that particular area. One of the things that I have touched on briefly, and I really wanted to talk about more, was the crowdfunding bill, AB 511. And, just to kind of fill in the blanks now on crowdfunding and some of the issues and some of the areas, what we see, really in 2012, I had great hopes that crowdfunding was going to be an extraordinary funder of small business. I think many of you are familiar with GoFundMe's or with Kickstarter, and that is one way to serve that. But this bill, Jumpstart Our Business Startups, the Jobs Act from 2012, what it did was it actually legalized raising capital for small businesses, and that would be equity capital by selling part of your particular business. So we're going to probably have a program on this coming up after the first of the year, but really kind of an interesting way for small businesses to actually raise funds. And it's really for those that want to invest in small businesses, it's a way for people to actually go to particular sites, read up on small businesses that are starting and growing across the country, and personally invest in it. So when the bill was passed in 2012, it got off to a slow start. There were a few equity crowdfunding sites. Some people raised money. You do give up equity in equity crowdfunding. So if you have a startup right now and you own 100% of it, there will be a valuation process to go through. You will be basically selling shares of stock and selling shares of ownership in that business. But it's what the big businesses have done forever. And now it can be something that can fall all the way down to small businesses. I still think that the future impact on this is huge. So not being able to really get into that much detail on this particular subject, one of the things that we really was a problem is that the expenses for startup businesses to use this type of funding was extraordinarily expensive. And, on the slide here that's not covered up by our new logo is the prohibited expenses for small businesses. So, with reviews and audits, there was a requirement in there for a small business had to have an audit and had to be an audit done by a CPA firm. Oftentimes these would have to be done in the past. So you basically, if you'd want funding now, you would need 3 years of statements. So you got to go back and audit 2 or 3 years. Very expensive process. So moving forward, this bill, created an exemption from state law and actually also to SEC regulation that would allow the reviewed financial statements for seed offerings of up to 300,000. So going in and having complete audited financial statements and having reviewed financial statements is going to be a huge difference. A CPA firm must, certify that they had audited the return, the books, in order to come up with the financial statements. Now what they're doing is just going through a review process. And so that's for seed offerings up to 300,000. So that's going to be the new hot ticket. So for businesses that want to attract investment, are not shy about giving up ownership, 300,000 is going to be kind of the new threshold. So also there were, a lot of other things that kind of came up in the original Jobs Act, such as attorney fees and other costs that made it prohibitive, and class action waivers. That has been also taken out as part of the crowdfunding legislation. So for those of you that have been around Webinar Wednesday for a little while, you've probably noticed we've talked about EIDL. We like EIDL. We think the changes to EIDL have been very beneficial and have been good for a lot of businesses and a lot of people out there. So this was just our one pager that we threw out there. A couple of the key points on the one pager is it does have some nice links on where to go to for creating an online portal and applying for the first time. It also gives you kind of a checklist to go through, and there's another list there. So a lot of resources that are available to help you. Now, the big changes was EIDL was considered, when it came out, a 6-month program. The pandemic back then was considered a 6-month problem. Now it's considered a longer problem. So EIDL has reflected that longer period of time, and now it's a 24-month period. So your expenses can be used 24 months from when you've received them. So the EIDL payment has also been deferred, and it can be deferred, but remember that the interest still accrues. And then the other big thing is, whereas the EIDL loan increases from a maximum of 500,000 now to $2 million, the program is open until the end of the year or until funds are extended. And really the uses of being able to use EIDL funds differently than you have in the past has been huge for a lot of borrowers. You can now use the money to pay off commercial debt, lines of credit, credit cards, any state or local government-backed debt. And before, we used it as an emergency. Again, as I'd like to say, the EIDL program, when it came out, was an emergency funding program. It funded an emergency and actually keeping your business going. Now it is a funding program for recovery businesses to help them get to the next level and get to the next step of their business life. So a couple things. If you're a reconsideration, again, you can actually do a reconsideration if you've been declined in the last 6 months. And you can email SBA at their particular portal, or you can log in. You can log into the portal, or you can call their toll-free number, which we have in many of our chats. So a lot of ways to find out. What you want to find out is why you were declined, because along with changes in the EIDL program have been changes in the underwriting. The underwriting has changed both for the good and for the bad for some borrowers. But you could find out that your credit score, when you originally might have filed, your credit score changed or actually went up, or actually the requirement for credit score went down. That's one way it could make a decision. So, but try to find out why the SBA declined your EIDL, and then try to figure out, how you can address what to do to change that decision. You can request additional idle funds, even if you don't need the entire $2 million. You can actually request more idle funds at COVID idle increase requests with an S at sba.gov. You can go in the portal and do the same. So you can actually apply for new. You can apply for reconsideration if you are declined, and you can also apply for additional funds. You know, some tips that we try to tell individuals that the SBDC is that, you know, any loans over 25,000 are going to be secured, and really you need to work with the with the SBA. You need to work with the SBA if you're working on selling some of your assets and you have an idle loan. So whereas they do a UCC1 filing with the Secretary of State, which is kind of a blanket filing, they can be behind a lot of your other debt if you have other business debt that's leveraging your business, or they can just be there by themselves. But it's something that you really need to take into consideration when you're selling assets and other things in the particular business. We also really want you to maintain your paid receipts, invoices, or canceled checks for 3 years after your disbursement. Now, in accounting for idle funds, it's my interpretation of this is that you don't have to just every payment that came out of the bank account or when those funds were used, you just need to kind of use funds that were not used for other programs, but kind of in a period of time that is allowable. Another thing you can't do is you can't relocate your business. So if you have already located your business in one community and you want to move to say Texas, you know, or other states, there's a lot of outflux here in California, a lot of outflow, people moving out. And you want to take your funds and relocate your business, you cannot do so without prior consent of the SBA. If you buy goods and machinery and equipment, it was only for American-made products, and you had 2 years to address a larger size. Our California Venues Grant program is open. And you know what we've been talking about the California Venues Grant is that it's easier than the federal version of the Shuttered Venues Grant. So it is easier. And it's been affected, but those affected by COVID-19 obviously is going to be, you know, a big test in all this, because with most pandemic relief, your business has to have been negatively impacted by the pandemic. So eligible businesses are, you know, venues in California. You have to have be validated through a tax return, needs a California address on that. There's an application process for each particular venue. Complete a new application, even if you applied for some other California small business relief program, like say the California Relief Grant. We will take a separate application for this. So what are you going to need to do and provide? You're going to need to actually complete and sign and self-certify the truthfulness and accuracy of the information you provide. So everything that you provide, you're doing the same thing you did for your PPP and other programs, and you're self-certifying that the accuracy is there on those particular reports and returns. So business financials, you're going to need some of your 2019 federal returns and state returns, and your 2020. And that is all pages of that. So you will be uploading this into a portal. The portal is being operated by Lindustry.com, who did the California Relief Grant program. And also, you're going to need to provide a government issued ID, an driver's license, a passport. It must be valid. And this is where we've been running into problems where you really have to distinguish between people phishing and trying to hack your information and steal your information, and then actually the government actually determining that you aren't fraudulently applying for this particular program. So it's kind of like both sides don't trust the other on this, I guess, is what it all boils down to. So you'll need interim financial statements, you know, covering specific periods. You're going to need your official filing through the Secretary of State if you're incorporation or LLC or partnership. You're going to need a local business license or a fictitious name registration or a fictitious business name that is generally done through your county in California. And nonprofits will need an exemption letter. So a little bit more details. So what's an eligible business? Here's an eligible business. It basically means you have a venue and you have the following characteristics. You have a defined performance in audience space, you have sound equipment, and you engage one of the following individuals. So, number of different things right there: booker, promoter, sound engineer, stage manager, etc. As we mentioned, the grants can go up to $250,000, $1.25 million in gross receipts you would need to show on your 2019 taxes in order to make that possible. Look at that, eligible businesses. Boy, that's a lot, isn't it? Glad I'm not reading that. So let's jump to the bottom. Let's jump down to some of these other things where you have sports teams. So these are the North American Industry Classification System codes. Again, we call it NAICS, N-A-I-C-S, because we like to spell out acronyms. So it could be any of these particular following North American Industry Classification codes. And could be for sports teams, promoters, performance events with or without facilities, drinking places, full service restaurants are not eligible, sorry. So as I like to say, I still don't know if this is first come, first served, and how long $150 million is going to last in this program. And also your shuttered venue operator grant recipients are welcome, but will you be placed afterwards? Really, the prioritization of this is really something I have no idea and haven't been able to get an answer. Will smaller grant requests get priority or earlier access? I think it's possible. I do think that that's possible as the smaller venues continue to try to reach out and actually move in that direction. So, it looks like I had a little interruption right there. Some more of the qualifications, really going to the CA Venue Grant website is something where you're going to find a lot of this information and continue to find what's out there. So moving on to actually employee retention tax credit or employee retention credit. Again, really would send you back to our YouTube page and to see last week's special guest. But just real quickly, the unique thing about this particular program is we've talked about so many programs where you had to be in business on February 15th of 2020. Sometimes you had to be in business on 2019. So this one is different where you can be a recovery startup business. You could have been in process or you started up after that particular date. And so there are special rules for recovery businesses. And again, for this instance, you actually began business after February 15th of 2020. You had to have annual gross receipts that were less than $1 million. And also, you're not eligible for the employment retention credit under the other two categories of partial suspension or decline in receipts. And again, as always, what we're trying to do here is we're just trying to manage our pandemic relief programs and know our timelines, get our ducks in a row, apply for programs that we can use, and also then kind of take that information and those resources and move our businesses forward, because it's really managing your business through and beyond the pandemic, which is going to make the difference now that you've survived. On the PPP forgiveness, some reminders for those of you that still haven't gone through the particular process. The timeline is basically 24 weeks to use your funds if you elect the 24-week covered period. From that, you have 10 months from the end of the covered period to apply for PPP forgiveness, 60 days for your lender and 90 days for the SBA to kind of go through that particular process. We also have that we could share with you, not going to go over it in great detail, but there's an appellate process that came out. And so there's an appellate process that came out. We'll gladly share that information if anybody or you know somebody who's looking to appeal for PPP forgiveness. Again, that must be timely also. And so really it's something that if you have actually gone through that particular process, you will need to actually take those necessary steps to look into that. But it is a detailed process, so it's out there as well. So on PPP forgiveness, we have 10 things to remember. The program intent was designed for payroll and to keep it simple. You're going to work with either your lender's process, because with PPP forgiveness, your lender is always the first source, the first person that you go to. They could have a process that you want them to take, or they could drive you to the SBA portal. Electing your PPP covered period, we see most businesses elect the 24 weeks. There were instances when you would elect 8 weeks and then try to get another PPP loan. That was a 2021 version when they changed the rules for PPP in early 2021. And again, you're going to need to actually meet or exceed the payroll. Again, it was the Paycheck Protection Program. And to get it forgiven, you're going to really need to jump in and to kind of look at those things and to kind of keep that in mind. We'll look at the forms in a second, but you're going to want to select the appropriate form to help you go through the particular process, gather your documentation, and then also make certifications that funds were needed and spent accordingly. So, when you go through that particular process, I know most of you have, but there are still surprisingly quite a few people that are still going through PPP forgiveness. So there are 3 forms that are available for the process: the 3508, 3508EZ, and the 3508S. So starting with the 3508S, it's for those that received 150,000, and actually it is a simple process to where you just basically signed off. The SBA's EZ form is for greater than 150. Also, if you did not reduce, your employees' salaries or wages by more than 25%, or used one of the other directives as far as being closed, but also if you're self-employed without any employees, it's the EZ form that is the one that is recommended for use. And then the standard form takes on all of the other aspects and all of the other larger ones, or if you're applying with a safe harbor. So if you're applying with a safe harbor, that goes through that particular process, and self-employed with employees can use that one as well. So thanks to our Biz2 Credit for providing that information. As far as documentation, you just really, even if you have one for under 150 and you're not having to go through the process of sharing your documentation, you do need to know that that could be audited. And if it's audited, you're going to need to show those documents and those expenditures. And those expenditures are going to need to come from a variety of sources. It could be the bank account statements or third-party payroll providers. It could be tax returns, whatever ties your expenses that you used for your PPP funds. It could be payment receipts, canceled checks, it could be rent payments, it could be health insurance payments, it could be a variety of other things. But we do know that at least 60% of that is going to likely be from payroll. And so oftentimes your payroll service, your payroll program, depending on how you calculate and how you do your payroll function, is going to be what you're going to want to pull those particular forms together. So again, just in summary, to apply, you're going to want to contact your lender and find out the particular process. You're going to want to compile your documentation and get your payroll reporting forms and other means of payroll. And then, you're going to want to do other things as well. And one of those is a couple of resources that we have there, calculating payroll expenditures. So both payroll and non-payroll, if you have those types of expenditures that are available, any mortgage payment interest. And then remember, this year we actually changed and actually received some newer type of non-payroll expenditures, such as covered property damage, covered operations expenses, covered supplier cost, and then covered worker protection expenditures that you had. So any of these expenditures, if you still have a 2020, a PPP-1, the one that came out in 2020, if you still have one of those, all of these particular expenditure categories that weren't available until basically 2021 can be retroactively applied for that initial PPP-1 filing. So there's some questions that we tend to go through, but I think we have a couple of questions and we have a chat box to go through. So let's just kind of move on and let's see next week. We'll see. And moving into our question and answers box. And more of a comment. Don't believe we qualify for the California Relief Grant, but we apply just in case. So it's always good to apply. I've heard in most cases that it's the other way around. If you weren't able to qualify for the shuttered venues, then you generally could get in. But again, it is by select North American industry classification system codes. So yes, but it's good to actually do that and to apply anyway. Going through our particular chat box, Maureen Busher-Dang, our expert producer on this, and actually she wears several hats, but during this hour, she is the producer and she's able to put a lot of different things in here. She gives you the links to the webinar Wednesdays that I discussed, where you can find more information on those particular topics that we talk about in once a month in great detail. The EIDL changes, back to one sheet, how to apply for EIDL. There's the customer service number. We talk a lot about that with EIDL. The customer service center, a good place to call if you're having any particular type of problems or issues with that. Some of the other links that are available in here, the COVID-19 EIDL links for establishing, if you want to do a new EIDL, and then also a lot of the checklist on particular EIDL. There's the link for the California Venues Grant Program that remains open for another couple of weeks. There's the employee retention FAQs that we think employee retention credits we're just going to say is open till the end of this year as well. There's your place to go for appeals if you have a PPP appeal. And it's interesting because I have ran into individuals who have had issues with the payments, the amount of payment from their lender that they got actually forgiven. So that might be a particular process with that. Yeah, thank you for mentioning the new logo. Did cover up some of the content on the bottom of the pages. And yeah, I went through and I cut that, but apparently didn't save it afterwards and they popped right back on me. So I see we're having some issues with maybe somebody's having problems. A few of our people are having problems maybe getting the ability to copy the chat comments. So we will look into that and see if something happened on our end. If not, we will definitely still have our on-demand links, and all these links will be sent out via email with a copy of this recording later this week. So yeah, so if you're having a problem pulling that, go to the chat and do a screen share, I guess, if our links are not being pulled off, and we will get into checking into that particular program. But again, the on-demand will be coming out by email for anybody that signed up for this, the recording and all those links. Okay, well, my voice is telling me it must be close to 1 o'clock, and it is. So let's wrap this thing up right now. And let's remind you that next week we are going to have George Flores with us from the SBA. Might talk about some of the other things and about maybe some of the other issues that are happening with EIDL. But the intent of next week's program is going to be on veterans and on a veteran focus. This is National Small Business Veteran Week this week. So support your veteran-based businesses. We'll have more on that next week when we do our dive on our Veterans Day program on November 10th. So if you have any issues, any questions, do contact any of your 5 SBDCs throughout the Central California region. And until then, this is Kelly Bearden saying goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next week. And maybe you'll see me next week. So long.